I totally agree, but you choose to
I
do what
choose,
you
I
do.
do. I don't spend enough time playing, but I will spend time with my grandchildren. They like to do
But you
songs, so
have priorities in a good place.
I'll try to match them. Okay, so no, this was the second next semester, right? So we're still doing Hebrews. I don't know. I think,
We're about halfway through now.
and you know, I'm eventually going to produce a translation. I hope to get it put together. I'll try to do it in the same format I've been giving you. I finally figured out a good format, but Hebrews forced me to do it. This is just complicated stuff. You know, what can you say? I mean, Hebrews is a, what do you call it, a great deal of difficulty, even reading it in English. Okay, how many read in English and go, oh, I got this, right? No, it's hard in English, right? So the translators have their problems. Of course, we know they have their problems anyway, which we find with these words. Here's the word of the day. You know, if I gave you every word, you'd probably even be more surprised, but that's okay. S-I-S, metathesis, metathesis. From meta means mid, and thesis means to place. So this word, by logic, now remember the Greeks are into logic, so the words always are the same, right? Or they intend for the words to always be the same, not like English. We are really interested in some of the words we use because they have changed over time. As a matter of fact, I don't know who signed me up for this. Maybe one of you guys did, so I won't blame you. But somebody signed me up for a word of the day thing that I get. And it's kind of cool, but some of the words are unusable, right? Because never write using words that most of the people will have no idea what they mean because they're worthless, right? But in English, our words come from every language, from every place imaginable, and we do funny things with our words. We take words that are perfectly good, like the one you know, right? Charity. You know, it used to mean like love, but somehow it's become whatever it is. And martyr, which used to mean witness, right? And has become like killing people for your faith kind of thing. So, I mean, words are really interesting. Now, this word, though, Greeks did not believe that.
They weren't around long enough.
They were around longer than we have been, but yeah, whatever, their language has changed today, right? But when we go back to ancient Greek, and that's what they argued. Matter of fact, at least the Greeks, let's give the Greeks about 1,000 years. And for Athenian Greek that we're talking about specifically, that's about 500 BC to somewhere around 300 BC. From about 300 BC on, that's what we call the Koine Greek era, or the era of universal Greek. So, you know, Athenian Greek, but I argue, okay, let's make this very clear. There is Athenian Greek. There is also Spartan Greek. There is Theban Greek. There is Macedonian Greek. Every area in Greece had their own language. Just like when you, well, language or idiom. Just like when you go to the Bronx, give me a cup of coffee, please, right? In the Bronx. Or you go to Boston, and they got the Boston accent. Or you go to the South, oh, hey, y'all, right? The Southern thing going, or the Midwestern thing going, right? So we have idioms, but nothing like the idioms of the past. Why?
Communication wasn't. I mean, you're more isolated back then.
Yeah, they couldn't watch TV. They couldn't turn on and see, you know, whatever, the Today Show. What are we going to watch? I don't watch TV, so I don't know. But you couldn't read a newspaper. You know, you didn't have the kind of communication we have today. So that caused people to separate idiomatically. And Athenian Greek was the Greek. The Greek. Every classical Greek word or work we would attribute in Athenian Greek until the Koine Greek period. Now I ask you a question. With that knowledge, how different do you think Koine Greek is from Athenian Greek? I'll throw that out for you. Anybody familiar with what High Deutsch is? High German? Yeah, High German is what? What is High German?
The Hanover region. Usually it's the Hanover region of Germany, and it's considered the standard.
It's considered the standard German use. Because when I lived in the Rhineland-Pfalz, they spoke Pfälzisch. If you go down to Bayern, they speak Bernisch. And they have different words and different pronunciations. And even sometimes they use different articles, like der, die, das in Deutsch. They'll use different articles for different words. And that's a no-no in High Deutsch, Hochdeutsch. So what they do is the German kids are supposed to learn High German along with their idiomatic German. But guess what? They don't learn idiomatic German to read. They speak it. But they're supposed to also speak High German, right? So we would expect people to, what would you, if you were a Greek speaker in the Koinean period, from about 300 or so to the period we're talking about, what do you think you would really want to do if you, in your writing and your speaking? You'd want to speak High Greek, Athenian Greek. Because number one, it makes you sound superior, and your writing will be superior, right? So that's one of the reasons I argue that, especially in this period, even though we do this Koinean Greek thing, this universal Greek thing, I think that all the language we need to look at would be considered from, should be considered from an Athenian Greek standpoint. That's why I teach it, because I'm not an expert in Koinean Greek as much as I'm an expert in Athenian Greek. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I think it's a good one. The big deal is that if you remember back, one of the arguments that Socrates made, if you read my book, I even have part of it in there, was that all of the Greek language is based in logic and reason. So the Greeks, when they took words and smushed them together, in English we smush words together, and then what happens to those words? Do the meanings, like, well, remember when you were in school, way back, right? I remember back when I was in school, and it was only a few years for me, like, 2 or 3. But when I was back in high school, and they said for the SAT and the SAT, ACT and SAT, you need to learn a little Greek and Latin, right? Why?
Word structure, word, a lot of words.
Suffix and prefixes can help you understand meanings of words, even in English. However, the problem with English is many times those prefixes and suffixes have been messed up. However, in Greek, the Greek writers, Socrates and the Greeks would say they don't in Greek. So, with that...
Real quick time out.
Yeah.
Okay, when you talk about Greek, what percentage of the Greeks were writers? I mean, there has to be common people that, just like in every civilization, when they did their thing in the field or in the pasture or wherever they went, they weren't concerned about how they talked. They wanted to communicate. And that, I mean, all I'm saying is, what percentage of people of the time period we're talking about, Scripture, Hebrews, wrote?
Oh, tiny. However, it was the biggest problem we have, and this is something that's true in all times, okay? That there is only a very, in our country even, there is only about 25% of the people in our country are what we consider fully literate.
I agree.
Okay, so that's tiny. However, in the ancient times, it was a lot smaller than that. So maybe 1% or less were fully literate. And the problem with fully literate even, in this period, could you really read a book?
No, no, books.
No, you couldn't. You had to have a slave, a book slave, so you could memorize. Matter of fact, I just read, you know that latest text, I think they found a copy of the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of something or other. And did you see? It was a learning text, and did you see what they said about it? The syllables were separated. Syllables, not words. The syllables were separated by dots. So in this case, it would be right here. There would be a dot. And in Greek, that's called teaching Greek. So this was probably around a 300 or so AD document. But what's really cool about it is a teaching document. And what they did to help you learn was they divided not the words, but the syllables of the words.
It's kind of a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, which goes to the proof text of what I was trying to get with you for. Now, I don't think we fully answered the question, but I think that when you say the average person, right, the average person wanted to communicate. And so if you were in Athens, you would communicate with Athenian Greek. So everyone who spoke in Athens had the same basic Greek. Now, when that spread out, remember, where was Alexander the Great was from what part of Greece?
Macedonia.
Macedonia. So he spoke Macedonian Greek. However, all the documents we have that were from that period are in Athenian Classical Greek. So in other words, even when he took over, when Alexander took over the world,
The people that wrote about it wrote in that language.
well, and he did too. The thing is that they were writing Classical Greek because that's what they learned to write.
Well, that's partly because of his teacher.
Exactly. But remember, the point is this, the point I'm making is this, it's just like in China, they have like there's 6 basic languages in China, but all of them use the same written language. And they're all written the same, even though they're different languages, which is really hard to comprehend, right? But the same thing's true in our language too, right? Because you don't see a different New York Greek or New York English and an LA English, right? You see a common English. As a matter of fact, we have style guides in our thing. So what even I think
We have a common alphabet, but they spell words a lot differently.
well, I hope not. That we spell them all commonly because we have dictionaries, but that was only until Samuel Johnson invented the first dictionary, remember? So spellings were kind of, however, the Greeks were big time in spelling, although you do find spelling differences in a lot of the manuscripts, but not many. It's kind of interesting. I would argue that based on what I know of the Greek language, that probably the run-of-the-mill Greeks all wanted to speak classical or Athenian Greek. They thought Koinean was. The writing, though, became Koinean, and there are differences, definite differences between Koinean and classical Greek in some of the writing. But I would argue, some people have argued, I think incorrectly, that there's such a thing as biblical Greek. And sometimes I call that Koinean Greek. And therefore, what I'm trying to help you with is this. Remember how we find these words that are really theologically charged words all the time, like baptism or grace or, righteousness, right? We find these words, and what have we turned them into? Magical words. We turn it into magic. Because in the Greek, they mean something very specific, in classical Greek and in Koinean Greek. But then Strong's and Vines tells us, baptism it means Christian ablution, right? Christian baptism. And you go, no, wait a second. Are you telling me they invented a whole new word in Greek so it would be like baptism? And you go, no. What did they obviously have before Christianity came on the picture, in the scene? Baptism. And I told you before, almost every single Mysterion baptized. Mysterions baptized very similar to Christianity in lots of ways. And you go, okay. You see, what we've done is we've made it exclusive when a lot of these pictures are not exclusive. And what I think that does 2 things for us. Number one, it blends us to history, right? And it also blends Christianity into common humanity. In other words, what did Christianity do? It came in and it took over. And Tertullian argues in his great treatise on this, that why do you find crosses in Gaelic non-Christian sources? Why do you find crosses in Chinese? Why do you find crosses in Japanese? Why do you find crosses in, Islam is late, but why do you find crosses in Damascus even, thousands of years before Christianity or Islam or anything like that? Why? If you read Tertullian, Tertullian says that all long for God. All long for the God. And there are images, there are symbols that God placed in humanity. That when Christianity came along, everyone who knows anything about Christianity goes, holy smoke. The cross really had a fundamental meaning within the context of Christianity. But what context did it have before Christianity?
It was a common means of execution.
Not really, not until the Romans. The Romans were really the guys who invented this, and I don't know how they discovered it. I mean, I wouldn't want to be the, you know, did somebody accidentally just get hung up?
Carthage?
What's that?
I thought the Carthaginians invented it and the Romans picked
Borrowed
it
it?
up from them.
They could have. Carthaginians are horrible. They're the most evil people on the face of the earth. Man, they were so evil, the Romans and the Greeks wiped them out, you know. So I wouldn't doubt it. But yet, you know, crucifixion was not and is not that common in the past. Really common in, I didn't know so much about Carthage, but it's really common in the Roman Empire. You know, the Romans did it as kind of a, you know, normative kind of thing.
But they learned it from the Carthaginians.
But they learned from the Carthaginians. And where did the Carthaginians get it? I don't know, maybe they...
Probably.
Got a good imagination.
Well, they were the ones that had they're the ones that had the infant, you know, they murdered infants. They had the infant, you know, they did infant sacrifice. Yeah, there's a name for that place. I can't remember. Anyway, what's that? Top Fit. Yeah, Top Fit. The Top Fit, you know, the two places we found them in Jerusalem and in Carthage. So anyway, the big deal is, the point I'm trying to make is that Tertullian argued that as Christianity expanded, one of the reasons that people accepted it was because a lot of the symbols of Christianity appealed to them naturally within the context of their culture and their religion. And so they go, huh, you know, this is for us. You know, remember I pointed out the commonality between Mysterion and Christianity, which, by the way, the Mysterion has different reasons than Christianity for doing a lot of the different symbols and rites that they did. But within the context of Christianity, what did Christianity do? Came into Mysterion and took them over, right? And then it appealed to the people, so they accepted it. So I find this, you know, language is similar. The language is really interesting. Why pick Greek? And why Greek? And yet Greek was the universal language. And I think that almost everyone, like even if you spoke it with a funny accent because you were from India, right? The Greek that you spoke was probably, you tried to make it as close to classical or what they considered Koine classical at the time. I just think that a lot of it was classical Greek. And this is the point. Metathesis, mid-place. What would you say that means in English?
Place in the middle of.
To put something in the middle of, right? But look at the translation. I gave you the piece of paper here. Metathesis is translated generally change, removing, or translation. And you go, huh? What? Where did you get that from? If you go to Woodhouse, you find that this means literally to put something in the middle up. Woodhouse is the source for Athenian Greek or classical Greek. This other word, A-N-A-G-K-E-S, anagekis, something like that. Anagekis. Ana, let's see, ana means to up, and agekis means arm, literally an arm. It comes, let's see, the word base, akageo, from agos, to bend, the bend of the arm, the curve of the arm. And when you put up arm, now, look what they translated. Distress, must, needs, necessity, needeth, and needful. The Greeks would say they have the word constraint. In other words, up arm, the way that the context you're using this in is like if I put my arm around your neck, right? Which is really Greek. That's pretty Greek. Because Greeks really had a lot of direct analog type of words. So you could take this, you know, we would say you up arm by getting more strength or power. And you can get that from this too, because if I up arm, I'm constraining, right? So the word directly means constraint, and it could imply distress. In other words, why you're distressed? Somebody's got their arm around you, right? Yeah, this is very Greek, because remember, Greeks were into wrestling holds, right? So, translated as distress, must, needs. My point is this. very clear. This word is super clear. This word may be a little bit less clear, but with a concrete picture, you kind of get it. But let's see what the context of the words look like. So let's start at 11. That's where we were before. First, I'll read it in the translation. If perfection could have been obtained through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of the law it was given to the people, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek and not of the order of Aaron? If therefore, actually it's not therefore, but if certainly, not there, if certainly, teleosis, completion, were, and that was the word of the day I think last time, was by or through the Levitical, the hierosony, the sacredness, for literally gar, assigning a reason over, not under, over, autos, it. The people, the los, received the law, nomotheteo, legislated the law. They legislated the law. Tis further still, cherry, employment, was there that is added. Another heritos, other or different priest, should stand up. Anistemi should stand up. Remember, anistemi ek nekros is to rise from the dead, but this just says anistemi. Stand up down, not after, but down the taxis, the regular arrangement of Melchizedek, and not or never be called or argued after the order of Aaron. Not to be legoed, argued after the order of Aaron. And so the translation of this is, if certainly completion were through the Levitical sacredness, assigning a reason over it, the people legislated the law. What still required another priest to stand up down the regular arrangement of Melchizedek, and never logically down the regular arrangement of Aaron. And I pointed out last time, the thing I want us to take from this, the reason it says this, and I made a big point, remember when they came back from the diaspora, did they know who was in the order of Aaron? They didn't, because the records had been destroyed. As a matter of fact, even after that, do you remember the first thing that Herod did, or maybe not, maybe the last thing Herod did? Herod the Great? Anybody know what Herod the Great did?
Destroyed the records.
He destroyed the records in the temple. To do what? There's two reasons he did it.
Hide that he was an Edomite.
He was an Edomite, and he was not supposed, and what did it say in the Old Testament? An Edomite shall not enter the temple forever, no generations. The Midianites could go to the 10 generations, but the Edomites could never enter the temple, and therefore he could never be a true Jewish person. So he destroyed the records to prevent that, and the other reason he destroyed the records was,
Didn't want anyone else to be king, or to trace the kingly, to replace him.
it may have been, that's probably right. Maybe there's three reasons, but the other reason that I have gleaned from the literature is that he did not want a trace for the Messiah. So therefore, a trace from the Messiah would have to come from David, right? And so, was he in the line of David? No, an Edomite couldn't have been in the line of David. So he was not. And by the way, remember the line of David was broken by male, because the Hebrews didn't go through the male lineage, they went to the female lineage. That's why you have the Luke. You know, Luke's lineage goes through Mary, and Matthew's lineage goes through Joseph. So it's very interesting because there are breaks in that lineage. So let's give it three reasons. Number one, because Herod was Edomite, he wanted to get rid of that. Number two, he wanted to get rid of the kingship thing. I think that's a good point. But the other one, he did not want a trace for the Messiah. You know,
somehow there must have been records preserved, because those genealogies in Matthew and Luke do go all the way back.
Because he destroyed them at the end of his reign. So the people remember them at the time.
From the diaspora, I mean, something must have survived.
Oh, yeah, they did. From the diaspora, it did. It was kept in the temple. The temple had it, and the people used it. Matter of fact, that's what they say. Remember, they were trying to rebuild their records. That was the thing he destroyed, though. So the rebuilt records from the diaspora, which were in question to begin with, right? Do you have a comment, question?
Well, I was just curious, backtracking in the account of Matthew, what was the relevance of Joseph's lineage? Since he wasn't a relative of, a blood relative of Jesus.
No.
He would be his legal, he would be his legal.
His legal,
It would be legally,
Legally father.
but what's really cool about this is Luke asked, it is apparent in the record that Luke is a secondary source, went to Mary and talked to Mary because there's a lot of information that only Mary would know. And it's very obvious that Matthew, Joseph may have been dead. If you take the accounts, Joseph was dead. But Matthew probably took the account from Christ or his brothers or whatever. And right in their society, the big deal would have been from the father, but in the Jewish culture, it would have been from the mother, right? And so it's kind of funny that Luke, which is more Greek source, actually gives us more Jewish information. I think that's kind of interesting. So, in other words, the big deal here is it's obvious to the people. Matter of fact, this is like, what, the third diaspora, right? I've argued, and we don't know which is right, but it looks like it, that Hebrews was written after the destruction of the temple. So this is the third great diaspora. They've been kicked out of Jerusalem. They've gone down to Alexandria. I've argued that Alexandria is probably the place where this was written to, the groups, right? So they all know what's the problem. You can't, and remember, I've told you this before. So the Essenes have a temple, right? And they're illegally sacrificing to God. The temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed, so there isn't a sacrifice going on there. And that's the only place to legally sacrifice, right? And then in Alexandria we have a temple. If you remember, I've told you, in the Maccabean era, the big deal about the Maccabees was when the Maccabees separated, when they believed Jonathan was a high priest, and they believed that Jonathan took the Maccabees with him. Jonathan was the legitimate high priest out of the Babylonian diaspora, or at least they think he was. Okay, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Without records, it's hard to tell, but he was one who claimed it and said, I'm the Aaronic priest, I'm the guy. But when they were in the Maccabean era, when the Maccabees declared their sons to be both priest, high priest, and king, they had no legitimate trace, genealogy through Aaron. They were Levitical, but not from the Aaronic priesthood. So they couldn't be the high priest. So therefore, Jonathan took his ball and the priesthood and went and formed the Essenes. That's where the Essenes come from. The rest of the guys left are the Pharisees and Sadducees. Sadducees are the priesthood that are left, and the Pharisees are the rabbis, rabbinical orders of the teaching in the synagogues. So you have them, and then the Zealots came out of the Essenes later. So, and the other groups. But in any case, so I have Jonathan taking his guys, and he's the legitimate high priest, and he's illegally sacrificing. Then I have the Sadducees, this is before the destruction of the temple, who are illegally sacrificing because the high priest doesn't have a legitimate trace to Aaron. And I have the Alexandrians and their priesthood that came from whatever, I don't know, no one knows, right? So that's why he wrote this. So therefore, do we have a genealogical trace in the taxes of Aaron?
No.
Not at all. Not even close. Therefore, there is no high priest. Therefore, what you got to do? In the Greek worldview, what do you have to have? Well, in the Hebrew worldview, what do you have to have? Without a high priest, what can you not do?
Sacrifice.
You can't sacrifice, and therefore you can't be held for your unintentional sin. What about your intentional sin? You're way out anyway. It doesn't matter. But that's known. But it's it's one of those things you don't talk about very much, right? You don't want to get in too much trouble. So we have an issue here. It's a huge issue. Now, do we perceive this issue usually when we're reading Hebrews? No, it's not our issue. We don't worry about it. But think about this. Think about this. I'm a Jewish person. Okay? What am I always worried about? How do I reach God? How can I come to God? I have no means of sacrifice. I have no means. Remember, you don't go to the temple to pray, right? Jesus is the one who talked a lot about prayer. There's not a lot of talk about prayer in the Old Testament. There's a lot in the Apocrypha, but not the Old Testament. Okay? Most of the pray talk is about Jesus talking. Because you didn't talk to God, why?
Priest did it on your behalf.
Well, yeah, you had to go through the sacrifices to approach God. Because remember, if you saw the face of God, you're going to die, right? How can you approach God? Without a high priest, without a temple, I can't do it. This is a problem. Do you think it's a problem for the Jewish people today? It is a huge problem. It fills their theological tomes. They've kind of tried to ignore it, but it's a huge issue for them. Because how do you approach God? Do you remember I told you when we studied Acts, and you look at Paul, Paul had these set preaching, set arguments, logical arguments. Some he gave to the non-Jews and some he gave to the Jews. And the one he always gave to the Jews is, there's no hope. You cannot be justified by the law. Because there are 33 things that if you do them, which by the way, everybody in the diaspora did, you cannot come to God. You're messed up forever, for eternity. That was his argument. He came to them. And so this is a huge issue. And what do you think the issue is to the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians? What do the Egyptians got to look forward to? I'm a mummy, right? And the best I can do is I'm like alive in my tomb. Oh, this is not good, right?
And you're looking for your inner organs.
Yeah, you're looking for your organs. Oh. And then you got the Greeks. You know, the best the Greeks got to look forward to, right, is maybe the Elysian fields, maybe in Hades. And the Romans are like, well, I don't buy any of this. I want something better, right? So Christianity came and said, I have something better. And and even if you look at this from the Puddleglum. Remember Puddleglum? Anybody read? The Silver Chair, the Chronicles of Narnia? What did Puddleglum say? The most impressive statement since Blaise Pascal. He said, even if it isn't true, I want to live my life as if it is, because it is a great hope of salvation. It's the hope of ages, right? It's the hope. And that hope gives life to human breath. I mean, I think it's beautiful. But of course, he was giving that in the context of Blaise Pascal's argument, right? That even if it isn't true, you know, Pascal's bet, what else do you have to look forward to, right? I mean, beautiful. This is beautiful Christian stuff. You didn't know, delve into Hebrews. Hebrews is all about this. What is your hope? And what does the Hebrew scholar here say? The Hebrew writers say the reason there's hope is because there is a priest. Not only is there a priest, there's a sacrifice. Yes, ma'am.
Well, and that's how he starts out, the author, in the first three verses in chapter 1. He specifically says, not only is the sun the radiance of the Shekinah, but after he made purification for sins, he sat down and was done with his job, and he slept out and he said, I mean, he begins with that. The purification for sins, you don't need any more sacrifice.
And if you remember, you're exactly right. And if you go back, you know, we can't go back to every place, although that's beautiful to do that. But you remember I told you, the logical arguments in this document walk us through. We start with the priest. We're in here. Now we're in depth with the priesthood, because it goes on in 12. Here's what it says in our translation. For when there is a change of the priesthood, there also must be a change of the law. Now let's see what it says in the Greek. Gar, assigning a reason, the priesthood, the hierozonia, the sacredness being changed. Meta themai. Metathesis. It's not changed. It's, if you use the translation in Vines, it's to transfer, but I would argue that it's placed in the midst. Being placed in the midst. Okay, assigning a reason, the priesthood placed in the midst. There is cause to be from constraint, from angake, from up arm, from constraint. A place in the midst also of the law. This isn't exactly what it says, because here is a good Greek translation. Assigning a reason, the sacredness transferred causes to be from constraint, a transferal, and of law. Or, if you want to put it this way, which I think is even better, assigning a reason, the sacredness placed in the midst causes to be from constraint, up arm, if you like, a place in the midst of the law. In other words, it's not calling for a change of law. It's saying that where is the priesthood? The priesthood of Aaron is where? With the people. Are they separated from the people? No. They're placed in the midst of the people. As a matter of fact, do you remember? They did not give the Levitical, the Levites did not own land. What did they get?
They got a little grazing land, didn't they, for their flocks?
They got cities.
Yeah, they got cities.
They got cities. Remember? The Levites had cities in each of the areas that were owned by the children of Israel. They were placed what? In the midst. Likewise, Melchizedek. He's a Gentile, right?
Jews then.
But he wasn't from the thing of Aaron, right? But because he's a Gentile, right? A Gentile who tithed the Jews. He was what? That means he is placed in the midst. He's one of us. He's not somebody else, right? He's a person that the Jews, the Gentiles, you know, the Greeks, Romans, everybody could look to. See? So let's see. Keep in mind, all right, so a change of priesthood, which is not exactly what it says, and a change of law. If I put the priesthood in the midst of you, I also put the law in the midst of you, right? Remember what it says in the Old Testament? You're supposed to place God's word in your heart and on your head and on your wrist. Although I think they took two Greek and well, actually, do you see how they took a Greek understanding of this? Right? What would be our understanding? Oh, figuratively, I put it in, but they took a Greek understanding and actually put phylacteries on their head and on their hand. It's like, dudes, you didn't get it, right? In any case, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be mean, but that's, you know, it's like, come on. Anyway, let's go from 12. Let's look at it both ways. Let's go from 13. Here's what the translation. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. Okay? Who is he of whom these things are said? Well, I want to take it that way too. But they're talking about Jesus, right? So Jesus came from the tribe of Judah, right? He belonged to, and okay, I don't mind that. What tribe was Melchizedek from?
None. Gentile tribe.
Yeah. Do you see this? I mean, okay. All right. Romans, Greeks, Jews, and the Egyptians. All right, I told you this before. The Romans, you know, the Greeks are really concrete. It's got to be concrete. And the rest of the world has gone along with their little concreteness, right? Where do we get all our euphemisms and all our figurative stuff? It came from the Ish. I'll give you an ish because that is a good answer. But you know where it really came from in our culture. What is the Romantic language? What is the language? Latin. From Latin came French, and from French English, and Spanish and Italian, right? Those are really figurative languages and euphemistic languages. And you get good credit for Hebrew, because Hebrew is probably the worst. It is the most figurative language. Remember when we were doing Psalms and the word, this? Oh, okay, I'm drawing it in Greek because they use Greek, right? Elf means an ox, a friend, one. It can mean any of the 10, 100, okay, 1,000. Let's see, what else does it mean? Partner. That's pretty euphemistic, right? Which one do you want to pick? It's contextual, just like English, right? I love pizza, I love my wife, I love my dog, I love my cat, I love my kids. Contextual, just like English, where Greek is a lot less contextual. But you're right. I have the same problem in these languages. So, when I'm writing as a Hebrew writer, it's really funny. He says it's to the Hebrews. But I think it's obvious, it's written in Greek, that it's to the Romans, the Greeks. It's written to all the people in Alexandria. And so of this group, 3 of the 4 are going to do what? Look at this very figuratively. So if you want to go as Melchizedek, I'm happy with that, because it really puts a fun spin on it, right? If you want to go from pure Jesus, but you notice Jesus has been equated with Melchizedek. So as a Gentile, what am I doing? Yay, yay, somebody cares about me, right? Remember when we studied, what was the last one we studied? And we said the whole purpose in the book was to show, Romans, I think it's Romans, that the whole purpose in Romans is to show that Christ means something for Romans, right? Christ has meaning for the Romans as well as to the others. And so I think this is a key question, especially in this period. It's a key question today. Okay, let's see what it says in the Greek. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. Assigning a reason, he is added. Over. Assigning a reason over whom, tauto, these things are legoed, are laid forth in a logical argument. Metacheo, share or participate, in the midst, literally, of another, other or different, phule, offshoot, a sect, literally a sect. Apo off, which its host is actually whom no man, odis, not even one, gave attendance, literally prosecco, to hold the mind. Okay, this is really a difficult word. At the altar, the thurasterion, the place of sacrifice. Okay, I should have given you these words for the day because these are beautiful words. This word, prosecco. Not the champagne, although that could be good. Prosecco. Let's see. I know I have it right here, so I can break it up for you. Prosecco. Literally to hold the mind towards, to pay attention or be sacrificed. But this word, remember this word? We said there is prosecco and there is pro-marketplace, pro-anastemi. Do you remember that? Remember at the beginning when we were talking to Hebrews and we said that the priest, there's two places a priest can sacrifice toward, right? You can sacrifice to the marketplace, which is where the stuff eventually goes, but the marketplace means the sacrifice is for the people, right? Or you can sacrifice to the gods, right? Protheos. So we had that as a contrast that was in the part that Jesus Christ's sacrifice was not to God, but rather the sacrifice was for man. And that was a contrast. Here It's saying pro seco. In other words, the sacrifice is toward the thoughts. Suke. This is really interesting, isn't it? Because I'm sacrificing an animal, or I'm sacrificing in Christ's sake. He is sacrificing himself, right? The sacrifice is always for God. But the sacrifice for Christ did what? It was for mankind, for the marketplace. But yet now this talks about a sacrifice of the mind. Now look what it says. Gave attendance, literally to hold the mind sacrifice at the thurasterion. The thurasterion is, okay, translate altar, that's cool. It's not, it is the place of sacrifice. Now tell me, what's the difference between an altar and a place of sacrifice? Where did the sacrifice happen?
Did it depend if it was Greek or the Hebrew temple?
Yeah, it does, but
Well,
this, go ahead.
Sometimes the sacrifice, wasn't it done like, they slaughtered the animal or whatever outside, like, and then they took the blood to the altar farther away.
Okay, I'll give it right on to you. Here's the altar. Here's a Hebrew altar, and the Hebrew altar is within the boundary of the mesocline, right? Within the boundary of the temple. And here's a Greek altar, and here's the temple behind it. Okay? The big difference is, and if you go back to Leviticus, you'll find, or to any of the Torah, the animal was not sacrificed on the altar. It was sacrificed in front of the altar. That's where it was killed. And then its body was taken and done with whatever you did with one of the 5 sacrifices, right? So if it was a Holocaust, for example, the Ascension sacrifice is a Holocaust sacrifice, then it was prepared and burned on the altar. The things that were cooked in the Hebrew, there was a pot, and they would cook it in the pot, so they'd boil it, which doesn't seem like very fun, but remember, they couldn't boil stuff, so it was the only bowl of meat they had. I guess they got the broth, that was a big deal. In the Greek sacrifice, I killed the animal in front of the altar. And then what did I do on the altar? I would put pieces, parts, and I would generally, in a Greek sacrifice, we don't know exactly how the Greeks did it, but apparently pieces were cooked and then presented and then placed. So our concept of altar, you know, we get our concept of altar from the Old Testament when, you know, so-and-so prepared an altar, and our assumption is when they prepared the altar, they put the animal on it and slaughtered it, right? But no, that's not the way it worked at all. And you know that, right? You know that. If you go back and look at all the Torah, they never killed the animal on the altar. In the case of the Old Testament, the horns of, what did they do with the blood? Like, for example, the once a year thing where the priest went in, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. He would take the blood, right, and then he would sprinkle, he placed it on the tips of the altar, remember? And then he would place it in the mercy seat. There was an altar in the Holy of Holies. Did they ever kill an animal there? No, but they would place blood there. So, and they would place incense. In any case, our idea of an altar, right, all of our pictures, they're killing things on an altar.
Makes you wonder how you flop a cow up on an altar, but.
Well, yeah, we should have thought about that, right? I mean, why isn't this clear to us? Because that's not what they do, right? They never do that.
Like in Leviticus 1, it says when they're bringing the burnt offering, and let's see, they shall kill it before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and then they take the blood and
Bingo. Bingo. It's funny, okay, it's funny. We see, we think, we hear, we read these things all our life, right? And yet, until we draw a picture for ourselves and we see what's really happening, what have we done? We've developed in our own minds, you know, a certain scale of events of how they happen. You know, it'd be really cool. Of course, we can't do that, right? It'd be really cool to actually see all this stuff happening. You know, in the modern era we can't because that would be so cruel, right? But yet, this was the society. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, you know, when I was in school, we always had these flip chart, you know, pictures, you know, of Bible stories and so forth, and quite often sometimes you see the altar. But wasn't there kind of a sensitivity or whatever it is, because you're gonna have little kids looking at this, and you're gonna show something that's a bloody mess, or, you know what I'm talking about? Just,
Right.
so you don't get the true,
We shelter, right?
I think it's a little bit that, I mean, to a certain extent, maybe, I don't know.
Too sheltered, maybe.
But Abraham, I was checking back, Abraham put Isaac on, he built the altar, put Isaac on the
Yeah,
altar.
I'm saying
But that was
that's
way
true.
before all, like, Leviticus.
That was way before that.
Well,
All these other particulars were.
I know you looked it up. The thing is, I'd like to see what it actually says in the Hebrew. Because remember, Hebrew does have a distinct difficulty with pronouns, or not pronouns, with prepositions. And the prepositions, like for example, it's like in German. The preposition on in German means an, means something against. And so it can be translated on. Like I can have my hand on the wall, right? But in German, an always means against, as opposed to aus, means on top, right? So many times in translating, you have to be very cautious because the translation, for example, of the preposition, German has more prepositions than we do. We have many more prepositional phrases than almost every other language in the world because we like to say things very specifically. The Greeks like to say things very specifically. The Hebrews, on the other hand, not so much, yeah. Throw it here because, you see, why do I not need to tell you in Hebrew where the person is on the altar, where the thing is? Why?
Everyone do?
Because everybody knew. Yeah, when you wrote it, you know, in the Hebrew, it may not even have a preposition. It may say specifically that he brought him to the altar, or he put him before the altar, or he held him. Usually, when you kill an animal, it's standing on its own 2 feet, right? It's not trussed up. Although, he might have trussed up his son, because I think I'd been running too. You know, it's like, are you a nut, right?
It said he did,
I'm just saying though, you see the point is, well, there are lots of ways you can truss somebody up. He could have tied him to a tether, you see? Or he could have hobbled him, so he couldn't run away. I mean, but yet, in almost every case when you slaughter an animal, the animal is slaughtered by holding it upright or standing. And then you're supposed to cut the throat in a specific way. So it's very specific. What I'm just saying, and I agree, and I was telling Tammy this morning, you know, I think a lot of Victorian era stuff has affected our way of thinking. And I'm not going to pound the Victorian era because I think it's a very good and proud era. But we got a lot of our euphemisms and a lot of the things we think about stuff from the Victorian era. And probably because they expurgated all of our pictures. And, you know, our children, God forbid a child sees something that would be terrible, like an animal being slaughtered that you eat. I'm like, well, that's probably a good thing to see.
Went from a rural culture to a city culture too, took away a lot of that too.
Yes.
Kids that grew up on the farm, they saw pigs slaughtered and cows slaughtered all the time.
Yeah, it's just normal.
I grew up with a copy of A Child's Garden of Bible Stories. My mother read to me from it every night, you know, and my copy was published in like 1949 or something. And there's this picture of Isaac on the altar with Abraham with his upraised hand and this knife being
Yeah, I had that
thrown
same
out
thing.
of his hand, you know, and it's a
Yeah.
terrifying thing to see.
Yeah.
And I've bought a copy of that book since then, and there's nothing like that in there now.
You know what's funny is if you go back and you look at, for example, German literature, especially before, you know, even in the Victorian era, the German literature is nothing. I mean, they will show stuff that today you could never show to a kid. They put you in jail for showing this stuff, you know, like people being beaten or hit, or, you know, it's like cartoons almost, but it's, you know, realistic, and that's what they taught the children. And yet you go to the British side of the channel and you see what the Victorian era British kids were seeing, and you go, wow, what a dichotomy, you know? You know, no wonder that the German culture started two wars, you know, in the 21st century because of the 20th century, because, you know, really there was a huge dichotomy in the way they thought about the world. I don't know which is, you know, I do know which one's better. I'm just saying that maybe a little bit of hiding is not so good. Anyway,
Research some of the nursery rhymes. I mean, some of those are,
Oh,
those
yeah.
little
Gorish.
nursery rhymes are pretty gorish, yeah.
oh yeah, I've got the, what do you call it, the annotated Mother Goose. Have you ever read that? And you see the annotations on some of those? Yeah, yeah.
Beat their children and put them to bed.
Yeah. right.
Well, a lot
Beat
of
them soundly.
When the bow breaks, the cradle will fall.
A lot of them are euphemistic based on news or protests. They're protests against the king or protests against the society. Anyway, the translation I give this in 13, assigning a reason over whom these things lay forth a logical argument, participates a different offshoot or sect, of whom not even one had in mind, to lift a sacrifice at a place of sacrifice. So let's look at this. Assigning a reason over whom these things lay forth, literally a logical argument, participates a different offshoot. Okay, anyway, we'll look at this next time. The big deal I want you to kind of think about is, do you think the law changed? Do you think that's a good translation in itself? And if you look at the rest of the writing, even in the translation we have, if that connotes that. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.